Okay, so last time I finished up the D&D line and talked about the first edition of the AD&D line. Second edition AD&D I did not talk about. That was released in 1989. Although D&D and AD&D were going concurrently, they were not on any at all the same schedule. D&D, I've already talked about it almost through the end of the 90s. I can't remember exactly when it finally went out of print, or maybe it didn't until third edition. I'm not sure. In any case, let's catch up now. Second edition is either, depending on your perspective, the last old school edition or the first committed to not being old school edition, by which I mean it kind of depends on what you mean by old school. In terms of the rules, AD&D second edition was very similar to first edition, and all of the rules up until 2000 were very broadly compatible with and similar to each other. You could, without too much trouble, take any element from any one of the rules and use it in any of the other of the rules. And there were some differences, obviously, but mostly they were relatively inconsequential in terms of broad compatibility. So second edition cleaned up a bunch of stuff. It reorganized it so it was much easier to find stuff. And it also, curiously, it kind of tried to address a PR issue that had neither Wizards of the Coast nor Hasbro's involved yet, that TSR thought that they had. Namely, that they had been in the news and there were a bunch of angry Karens running around saying that D&D caused suicide, that it was Satan worship and all this other stuff. It was all complete nonsense, of course. But when has that ever stopped Karen? And the reality is, of course, that D&D probably profited greatly off of the edginess of these stories, and it made a lot of people come check it out for the exact same reason that during the exact same period people were listening to Ozzy Osbourne and stuff. There were all these rumors of him biting the heads off bats on stage and being all into Satan worship and stuff, which again, no, those were not true either, or at least not literal Satan worship. So, it kind of brought people for the same reason. It was edgy, and it kind of was like, oh, what's going on over there? And kids who kind of were into the edginess were attracted to it. So the fact that this stuff happened was actually probably really good for D&D, even though it was kind of nonsense and calumny and gossip and completely untrue. So for TSR to buckle under that perceived pressure and make it a more family-friendly version of the game, where the demons and devils were taken out, and the half-orc race was taken out, and the assassin class was taken out, and whatever other things that they removed, was probably kind of a dumb thing to do, quite honestly. D&D may have been essentially the same game, mechanically, as it always had been, but the mood, the tone, the feel, all of it was turned into generic corporate product, if you will. And I think that really kind of hurt the brand. A couple other things happened during this era that also hurt the brand. One of them is that TSR became infamous for suing anybody that was posting their own homebrew elements and whatever online. And the internet was still pretty new in the 90s. I still remember the old Usenet stuff that used to be going on in the very earliest web pages and GeoCities, and obviously a bunch of D&D fans wanted to create pages for their campaigns and put their homebrew stuff up and stuff like that. And TSR kind of sent them cease and desist letters and all kinds of other nasty stuff. It ended up being much more of a PR nightmare than the whole D&D is satanic nonsense ever was, because this one literally attacked the fans, whereas the satanic stuff actually brought in more fans and attacked the people who weren't fans, if you will. So that was bad news. Another thing that happened is that D&D during the 90s had the first real challenge that it had to its dominance as the 800-pound gorilla in the RPG industry. Now, of course, there had always been other RPGs by other companies, and some of them enjoyed success to a lesser degree than D&D. D&D was the one that was a big corporate juggernaut. But White Wolf, with their Vampire the Masquerade and the rest of the Storyteller line of World of Darkness games, was the first actual challenge to D&D supremacy. And I don't believe that they actually ever passed D&D in terms of sales or revenue. I don't think they even came very close, to be honest with you. But they were the first one that seriously challenged it, and that I think kind of rattled the designers. But that was in a good way. It kind of made them, forced them, if you will, to sit up and take notice of what else was going on in the industry. And I wonder sometimes how many of them did that and really paid any attention to what was going on outside of D&D itself. Other than that, second edition is well known as the edition of settings and splat books. And splat books, I mean stuff like the Complete Book of Elves and the Complete Book of Fighters or whatever. And there were a ton of these. Many of them were infamously terribly balanced. They were completely broken and just terribly written mechanics and splat books. But many of the settings are quite well known. Some of them still have, even now, decades later, still have pretty strong cult followings. I know Ravenloft has a strong cult following. Dark Sun has a strong cult following. Spelljammer has, I don't know if it's strong, but they do have a cult following. Planescape has a big cult following. And of course, Forgotten Realms, which technically came out during first edition, if I remember right, but it was pretty close to the line. Forgotten Realms became huge, and it kind of, as you probably know, in fifth edition, it's the default setting. But there was no default setting at first, other than in the D&D line, where Mystara, the known world, was the default setting. And AD&D never had a default setting. Now, all of this stuff, unfortunately, served to kind of splinter the customer base, so nobody bought anything in large enough numbers to really generate any economies of scale. And one of the things that Ryan Dancy, working for Wizards of the Coast, reported after he went to go scout out TSR in their, when they decided that they were going to buy them, is that the place was a wreck financially. They hadn't made any money in a long time. They were barely keeping the lights on. They were barely paying their employees. They just made one terrible decision after another. And the number one decision that they made was that they were insulated from the fans. They didn't really know what the fans wanted. And so they just kind of made whatever they wanted to make and hoped that it sold. And for the most part, it didn't necessarily. And they had just warehouses full of stuff that they couldn't move and all kinds of other problems. So, of course, Wizards of the Coast bought TSR and almost immediately brought some people on board to develop third edition. And here's where I pick up the story again. I dropped out of D&D when first edition AD&D was still current, so sometime in the mid-'80s. And I only kept half an eye on what was going on in D&D during second edition. I've since kind of picked up some of their material, the fluff material that looked interesting, and some of it was pretty good, for fluff at least. I have no interest whatsoever in the mechanics of second edition. I had already lost any interest whatsoever in the mechanics of first edition. Second edition is like, why would I want something that's rehashed but more milquetoast? I just didn't care at all, and still don't. Third edition, though, I've got much more complicated feelings about. It's the game that brought me back to D&D after I had spent a lot of time on RPG.net. I spent some time in the Storyteller system. I spent some time looking around for another system that better suited my needs. I didn't really find it. Third edition really wasn't it, but it took me a while to realize that. Third edition is both the system that brought me back to D&D and the system that eventually chased me away from D&D again at the end of the 3rd edition life cycle, which was actually relatively short. It only lasted for about 8 years. And that includes the revision partway through. So in 2000, 3rd edition came out. The most brilliant thing about 3rd edition, well, there were a couple brilliant things about 3rd edition. One of them, of course, was the OGL, the Open Game License, that said all our mechanics are open source, and anybody can make stuff that's compatible with it. You can even make stuff that's derivative of it to some degree. And there was a lot of cool stuff going on. It was a super exciting time to be a gamer. I thought 3rd edition was really cool because of what it did to the mechanics. They added much more flexibility, and although one of their mottos was back to the dungeon, which I had no interest in, another one of their mottos was tools, not rules, which absolutely is up my alley. And I found that if you didn't want to do dungeon crawling, the system supported that perfectly fine, even though back to the dungeon was a motto. That was really kind of something that was more in some of the modules, the Dungeon Magazine modules, if you will, all that kind of stuff. It wasn't really super baked into the system itself. And sure, there was a whole bunch of stuff in the Dungeon Master's Guide about wall thickness and all these mechanics about doors and walls and crap like that, which even today, I think I've only ever read the 3rd edition DMG once, and I'm pretty sure I skimmed or even skipped most of that stuff. So I like 3rd edition. It was very big compared to what it needed to be. There's a lot of material. 3 big hardcover books that were quite a bit larger than the 1st and 2nd edition books, quite honestly, although I had been out of the game, so I didn't necessarily recognize that right away. And I played it for a long time. I played 3rd edition from 2000 until probably 2016, 17, 16 at least. I know for sure I was still playing in 2016 before our group kind of started falling apart. By the time the COVID lockdowns came around, we had already been busted up as a group for a couple of years, and people had moved, and we just were done. So probably 2016, 2017, I played quite a bit of 3rd edition. And although at the end I got tired of it, I'll get to that in a minute. The very first thing, well, I don't know, maybe that's one of the very first things that bothered me of the 3rd edition era is that 3 years in, they released 3.5, the revision. And I'm still kind of salty, to be honest with you, that they expected us to go rebuy the 3 core books and rebuy the splat books that they were redoing, like Sword and Fist had been now replaced with Complete Warrior, and I can't even remember the names of all the. Tome and Blood was replaced by Complete Arcane, I think. So they replaced a lot of the splat books. I know for sure I have the Psionics Handbook and the Complete Psionics Handbook, for example. So I ended up gradually buying most of them, although because the SRD was a thing, I didn't buy a player's handbook or a Dungeon Master's Guide of the new version until honestly just a few weeks ago. So I went I went over 20 years without replacing those, and you didn't need them anyway, so I didn't really use them. But I did replace most of the splat books, and they gradually won me over because the system was a little bit better, and the splat books were certainly better. They really beefed them up and did a good job of trying to justify asking you to rebuy them by making them just better in almost every way. So I kind of made my peace with 3.5, but it left a bad taste in my mouth, quite honestly, that it was revised so soon. The other thing that started happening with 3.5 is I started getting more and more tired of the D&D-isms. Now, as there were more and more options, I could avoid a lot of them. If I didn't like the way magic worked, well, I had a bazillion other alternate magic classes that I could use. And in fact, at one point, I kind of made a point of collecting alternate magic systems if I knew of D20 books that had them. And I bought a lot of other D20 books. I bought, the Star Wars book. I bought the Star Wars revised book when it came out. I skipped the Saga edition, even though everybody said it was the best of the 3 Star Wars D20s, because I'd already bought it twice. I wasn't going to buy it a third time, and I still had never played it. I bought D20 Modern and a number of its splat books. I bought D20 Wheel of Time. That had an alternate magic system. That's the main reason I got it. I bought D20 Call of Cthulhu, which was probably, even now, my favorite D20 book ever. It's just a fantastic book. And if you can get your hands on it somehow, I still highly recommend it. And that was the one that really convinced me that D20 could do it all. Now, you might need to do a little bit of work to make it do it all, but it could do it all. But this gradually started to kind of come apart a little bit for me. D20, the 3rd edition, base system that all of these games were sort of based on, was very simple in at least one respect. Almost everything was based on a D20 roll, which is hence the name D20. And you wanted to roll high, you rolled it, you added any ability or other modifiers, skill modifier, whatever modifiers you may have, and you compared it to a target number called a DC, difficulty class. And if you made it, you succeeded. And literally almost everything in the game was handled this way. And that was one of the ways that the game was brilliant. It was stupid that of the non-weapon proficiencies of 1st edition, of late 1st edition and 2nd edition were just a real headache compared to this. And just, everything else where it's kind of like, well, roll a percentile, or roll just this random dice just because, or roll under your ability score. There just wasn't any consistency to how to do stuff. So everybody did whatever they felt like at the time, and gradually developed table rules, I guess, for how they would do things at their table. And it was, I think that the system needed the robustness of, here's a universal mechanic. Once you have a universal mechanic, you don't need all the rules that describe exactly how to use it in every single edge case. And that's one of the ways that 3rd edition went very, very wrong, is that they gradually started to define everything. And they started proliferating feats, which were a pretty cool idea, until they would release tons of feats for things that you'd read them and say, I would have thought I could do that without a feat, and it would have been easier to do without the feat. But now you're telling me I'm supposed to take the feat before I can even attempt it, and it's going to be harder to do? No thanks. And that kind of really hurt the game over time. The stat blocks were crazy. Like the Elminster stat blocks, for instance, in the Forgotten Realm campaign setting, literally take a whole page of very small font with just a very modest size illustration of them also on the page, kind of blocking up just a tiny, tiny bit of what would otherwise be text. It's kind of insane that they gave that much definition to everything. And it was fun that there were options for everything, but after a while, it was like, there's just too many rules. I don't need all these rules. I hated that combat almost obligatorily required a battle mat and tokens or miniatures. I don't like playing that way, and it's very difficult to play 3rd, 4th, or 5th edition without one, because they've made it so that it is. And I also think that the scaling problem, which D&D has always had, got considerably worse because characters were more powerful generally, and they got more powerful. And the game just broke down at some point after about 7th or 8th level. It just didn't work very well. I actually played one very lengthy campaign. It was the Age of Worms, which was an early adventure path that Paizo wrote before they split off and became Pathfinder, and they were still had the Dungeon and Dragon magazine contracts, and they were managing Dungeon and Dragon magazine, and they came up with these 3 adventure paths that were a huge hit in the pages of Dungeon, and each of them had 10 to 12 modules in it. I played the Age of Worms, which was the middle one, the one that came out in the middle, and we started at 1st level. I think we ended at 22nd, 23rd. It was so tedious at those higher levels. It was just so tedious, both because the way the adventures were written, where you had to go run around doing all these dumb fetch-it quests that really kind of screwed up the pacing, the meta pacing, if you will, of the campaign as a whole. And also because it just became so difficult to play the game at that level. We had combats that would last, an entire 4 or 5 hour session just for a single combat. And it was, I don't know, it became more tedious and more of a chore. The only reason I enjoyed it is because I enjoyed hanging out with the guys. I actually almost would have been fine just ditching the campaign and doing something else. Now, if I thought it was ridiculous that D&D changed 3rd edition to 3.5 after only 3 years, after only 5 years, they decided to change to 4th edition. This was not an announcement that was greeted with a lot of enthusiasm by the fans, especially as details of what 4th edition was going to be like started to come out. 4th edition, I don't know if this is literally true, but everybody kind of said it, and Wizards of the Coast never really denied it, that 4th edition had kind of looked at World of Warcraft and said, let's try to make a game that's more like that, because that's really popular. That is the dumbest thing I can imagine. Leaning into something that another venue provides better than you ever can is stupid advice. What tabletop RPGs need to lean into is what they provide that computer gaming never can. And that means DMs, GMs that can use their actual creativity and ability to think on the fly to handle things that programmers and developers never thought of. So if you go, quote unquote, off the rails in the campaign, well, you literally can't do that in a computer game. But you can, of course, in a D&D game. So I don't know if that's really 100% true. Regardless, 4th edition never really appealed to me much. My group kind of didn't really express any interest in it. I don't know if anybody ever bought it while we were still playing. I kind of gradually started acquiring some of the books again on the used market after they were old and cheaper. And it has its fans, don't get me wrong. I was not one. And I think that it also did a great deal of damage to the brand. So here's some of the things that kind of happened there at the end of 3rd edition and the launch of 4th edition. First off, they tried to ignore the OGL and say, well, 4th edition, there's not going to be an OGL. There's going to be a GSL, which is super restrictive. So you can still make some stuff if you want to, but we're going to make it so nobody will actually really want to. So that was a huge problem. A lot of people were kind of bent out of shape about that. I personally, because I'm not a content creator who depended on the OGL, I don't really care, and I don't understand why most fans would care unless they're huge fans of some third-party publisher, and that's kind of how they identify as, I'm a Kobold Press guy, I'm a Green Ronin guy. I wasn't that. I mean, I like some of the third-party products, and I have some that I really enjoyed, but I was like, whatever. So that kind of really ticked a lot of people off. The other thing that happened is that the OSR started, and what somebody kind of figured out, and they were able to stick their neck out there and say, I'm going to try it and see what happens, is that you could use the OGL to basically create retro clones. And so the first one, Osric, was deliberately meant to be a clone of AD&D First Edition, or at least it basically provided you the same rules, although rewritten and kind of done differently. But they were the same rules, so they were 100% compatible, or mostly so. And that really was it was done because, first off, all the older editions had been out of print for a long time, and they were getting harder and harder to find. And also, there was a whole wave of people, especially older players, who kind of were fans of the older edition, who had become tired of 3rd edition and its tediousness and its Twinkie superhero-ness, all of things that I kind of agreed with. Not that I was very OSR-like in a lot of ways, because there were a lot of things about D&D back in ye old days that I never liked, which is why I left it back in 1985 or so and looked at other games entirely. But I could kind of sympathize with at least the problems that they had with 3rd edition, even if I didn't agree with their solutions to it. Now, the OSR, I don't know how many people really belong, if you will, to the OSR, but they're kind of noisy and they are relatively high profile. So I think it was a blow to PR, the fact that the OSR even existed, much less that it was very successful. The other thing that happened is that Paizo kind of said, we're going to continue to use the old OGL and the old system, and we're going to make stuff for that. And then they kind of said, we also need to keep the game in print, so we're also going to use the SRD to print our own version. But, while we're at it, we might as well make some updates and improvements, but we're going to go through this open beta test so we get all this feedback and communication with the fans while we do it. This, of course, was hugely successful, and the Pathfinder game is a result of that, and it is a very derivative game of 3.5, and it is, I don't know, probably nearly as similar to 3.5 as 3.5 is to base 3rd edition. It is more powerful. It does have more options. It did kind of start to develop into Power Gamer's dream, but that really didn't completely happen until 2nd edition came out. For the most part, Pathfinder 1st edition was pretty similar to 3.5. So there were all these factions now. There were people like me in my group who continued to play 3.5. Although we were kind of the quiet faction, I think we were relatively big. I did notice during the years of 4th edition that 3.5 books never got very cheap on the used market. They continued to sell for a lot of money. And I think that's because people held on to them. People weren't really getting rid of them because they were still using them. Another group went and did the OGL, the OSR. Another group went and played Pathfinder instead. And anecdotally, and this is subject to some controversy and debate, but regardless, regardless if it's literally true, the fact remains that Pathfinder challenged D&D for supremacy in the market. It may have even passed it up in terms of sales for better part of a year and a half. And there's some good data to suggest that it probably did do so, although there's some people who kind of have counter arguments. The reality is nobody knows for sure how many copies were sold of all these books, except for the publishers, and they're not saying. So we can only try to get at it with circumstantial evidence. Regardless of whether or not Pathfinder actually outsold 4E, they clearly made a significant dent in their market share and challenged them again for supremacy in the industry. And they don't have to have actually won that battle to have won the battle, if that makes sense. They didn't have to actually pass up D&D in order to basically have won and said, we became a huge player, we ate a huge chunk of your market share, we made this whole thing kind of not work. In 4th edition, there were a lot of things that I didn't mind about it. None of them were mechanical. I hated everything I ever heard about the mechanics I did not like, with the exception of 1 or 2 rules which I borrowed here and there, like healing surges. Healing surges are a great alternative if you don't have clerics and magical healing, because you can use healing surges to replace them to some degree. And it becomes kind of like action movie violence. The hero gets all beat up, but a scene or two later when he needs to be, he seems like he's in pretty good shape. He has some, theater blood on him and his clothes are dirty, but he's fine and he can still kind of act normally and doesn't have any problems. That kind of, to me, is what healing surges are. I think they were over the top in a game that has tons of magical healing. There's no reason for it. But if you use those instead of magical healing, suddenly they're a brilliant idea. I also really like the idea of the minions. And I don't know why that didn't occur to me, because it's really quite simple. You throw hordes of monsters at the PCs, but they all have 1 hit point. So any hits at all, they immediately die. That is kind of a brilliant tactical move. And that's one of the things that 4th edition really leaned into, was the tactical gameplay. You had to have a battle map even more than 3rd edition. You had to have miniatures or tokens. It was just, you just literally couldn't play without them. And the whole game was focused around tactical combat. I don't know why, there are games that are tactical skirmish games that are better than D&D, and if that's what you want to do, why don't you just play like Talisman or, I don't know, there's plenty of alternatives. I don't know why you wouldn't play those. Mordheim, I don't know why you wouldn't play those instead of D&D. But, for whatever reason, D&D thought that's what people really wanted, and that's what they really leaned into. I don't think that was really true. 4th edition doesn't seem to have sold very well. It was kind of replaced by the D&D Essentials line, which was just kind of a reworking of 4th edition. It was laid out differently and organized differently, but it was essentially the same system. I don't really consider it a different game than 4E. But this life cycle of 4E didn't last very long because I'm sure that sales were disappointing, the PR hits were bad. And so they came out with D&D Next. They called it before it came out. And of course this is 5E. And they did a lot of the things that Pathfinder had done, like soliciting a lot of feedback from the players, basing it very heavily on the popular 3rd edition, and trying to actually fix some of the problems that 3rd edition notably had. Whether they were successful in doing so or not is a matter of debate, but clearly that was one of their goals. 5th edition is a game that's very much like 3rd edition, but it's more streamlined, and it's sometimes streamlined in ways that aren't helpful. Like, I think getting rid of skills, that wasn't helpful. Skills weren't a real... I don't understand why people thought the skills slowed the game down. At most, skill selection may have slowed you down for half an hour during character creation, but then when you're actually playing, it was never slow to have skills. So I don't know why they saw getting rid of that as a key point. And a lot of people complained about skills, especially OSR types. I still don't understand why. To me, and granted my experience is kind of limited, 3rd edition combat still feels just as long and tedious as 3rd edition combat. Did I say 3rd? 5th edition combat feels just as long and tedious as 3rd edition combat. In fact, it feels more or less exactly the same. It's really very, very similar. Hardly anything about 3rd edition and 5th edition combat is different. There's a lot of things I don't like about 5th edition. I don't even like that it exists, to be perfectly honest with you, because I don't think it was needed. I don't like much of the art and the tone and the feel of it. I don't like that superhero overpowered nonsense has become even more pronounced since 3rd edition, although that happened also in the Pathfinder split, if you will. And there's other things I don't like as well. But there's some things that I do like about 5th edition. I think the lair actions are pretty brilliant. That's a great idea. I think it's maybe a little too jargony and mechanical, but still it's a good idea. I think advantage, disadvantage is absolutely brilliant. I think there's some other things that it did fairly well, but ultimately 5th edition fails because it has most of the problems that 3rd edition had, and I'm done with those. I'm tired of them. I don't like feeling like it's very difficult to make a character without some online tool to help you do it because it's too complicated. And part of that's because I think the player's handbook is poorly written, but still, cross that bridge later. I don't like feeling like I have to have a grid and tokens or miniatures in order to successfully have a combat. I don't like that combat takes center stage so much that, again, it sucks up all of your gaming time. I played all of one session so far, 5th edition. I've got another one coming up soon. I should have also run it by now, but of course it didn't happen. We had to reschedule it. And that session was basically an entire extended combat sequence that lasted for 3 hours. And I just said, just deja vu. This is 3rd edition all over again. So I'm kind of over D&D. Not only that, TSR, Wizards of the Coast has really screwed up their public relations in the last couple of years, even worse than they did during 4th edition, even worse than they did during 2nd edition. And I think that maybe, I don't know. I think that they've really pissed off a lot of customers. I'm just kind of done with them. I don't care about their behavior or whatever because I was already done with them years and years ago, and I just don't have any interest in them anymore at all. So anyway, that gets us up to date. Of course, now we have the so-called 2024 revision to 5e is literally just coming out as we speak. It looks like it's made many of the same mistakes that 2nd edition and 4th edition have made on top of all new mistakes that it's making on its own. Whether or not it's successful or who knows, we'll see, I guess. I think it'll be successful enough, but that's in part because the customer base and the audience has changed significantly. I think it'll sell to different people than the people who played D&D in the past, most of whom will now be looking for other options because there are others that are better. And one of the things that Wizards of the Coast finally pulled their head out of their butts and did right is they decided to make older versions of older publications that they own the property of available. You can easily buy all your AD&D stuff, all your basic expert stuff. You can buy all that as PDFs or even as print on demand. It's readily available. I don't know why they didn't do that long ago when PDFs first started. They could have kind of blunted the entire formation of the OSR if they had done that, but they didn't have the foresight to do so, so they created this whole kind of anti-Wizards of the Coast block of customers that is still, constantly like a tick on them, bleeding customers away even today. They could have, I don't know, they could have prevented it altogether because I think a lot of people would eventually have migrated into something similar. But they did it in such a way that they made a lot of people angry and upset, so they kind of created this almost anti-Wizards of the Coast block of gamers, which was foolish. Anyway, we'll drop it there. Good heavens, I'm so rambly. I've talked for so long. I'm just going to go ahead and end it here, and we'll talk later about my setting when I come back.